Today we're talking about crisis comms and the erosion of trust. And I'm really delighted that to welcome my guest today, who is Kate Hartley. She's a PR guru who's helped set up Polpeo and is the author of Communicate in a Crisis, a book, as the name suggests, which is on crisis communication in a social media world. Kate, I hope you're there. I hope you can hear us. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and also tell us what Polpeo is too, please.
Hi, Jim. Yes, I am here and I can hear you. And I actually, to answer one of the questions on the Q&A, I don't hear any duplication or echoing.
Good.
So
there must be a
hopefully,
feedback loop, I guess,
yeah.
there. So who was it who called in with that? Oh, yes, Joanna. Joanna, you might need to, I don't know, maybe turn your own mic. No, you're not using a mic, are you? I don't know. I may, hopefully you've sorted this anyway.
So yes, hi, I'm Kate Hartley and I'm the co-founder of Polpeo, and that is a crisis simulation company. So we use simulation technology to help brands and agencies prepare for a crisis breaking, so they can see what it might be like to go through a crisis as it breaks on social and digital media. And we like to think it's the closest thing to going through a crisis for real. So it kind of gets you to test your crisis plans and your responses. And as you said, I've just written a book called Communication in a Crisis. That looks really at how people respond in a crisis and how, therefore, organisations can put together a response that's really effective in a crisis situation. And my background is, I always say 25 years. It's probably nearer 30 now, but I think I'm sticking to 25 of agency side PR, specialising in crisis communications.
Excellent, Kate. Well, thanks very much indeed. In fact, I've just finished reading your book, and I think we're going to use your book as a bit of a template for some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So listen out for that. Now, before I post my first question to Kate, I'm going to launch a poll. Just want to. This has a double plan, really, just to get you using the keyboard and so forth, and to sort of take the temperature of our audience. So a very simple poll here, which hopefully you can see, which is, and the question posed is, do you have a crisis comms plan? And we would like you to vote on this, if you will, please. I see our votes are coming in. We've got 42% of people have voted. Let's see if we can get a little bit higher than that. So do you have a crisis comms plan? Yes, no, or working on it. 76%, are we going to get any higher? We're up to 80% of our participants have voted. A few people still voting. Okay, this is last dibs now. I'm going to close the poll. There, the poll is ended, and I'm going to share the results with you, and hopefully you can see those poll results. In case you can't, yes, they do have a plan, 44%. No, they don't, 17%, and working on it, 39%, so nearly as much as yes. My opinion is, and I'd welcome Kate's thought on this, that any plan is better than no plan, because the best plan in the world will probably have to be changed during a crisis. Kate, have you got any thoughts on that particularly?
I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely right. And sometimes the shorter the plan, the better as well. I've seen so many crisis plans that are so complicated to use that actually they never get used. So sometimes the best place to start is with an escalation process and a list of contacts.
Yeah, indeed. I totally agree. When I first joined this industry a number of years ago, shall we say, you used to see these huge, massive business continuity plans, great ring binding, folders, which, as you say, Kate, people just didn't tend to look at. I mean, it's not really what I want to get into today, but what we are seeing a lot of these days are playbooks. So that, not a generic business continuity plan, but a playbook that might deal with a cyber attack or a terror attack. I'm sure you've seen some of those, Kate.
Absolutely, yes. It's exactly what we're seeing as well.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent stuff. Good. All right. Well, look. Let's move on here and ask you a question, Kate. So, my first question. I should have put that up before. I do apologize. There you are. That's Kate. They were looking at Kate, everybody. There she is. That's her at her desk there. But that's the information you know. So we've done the poll. So my first question, as you can see up there, is you once said that communicating with empathy will get you through a crisis, but empathy doesn't always go with leadership. And I was quite intrigued by that. What did you mean by that?
I think this comment is going to haunt me actually for the rest of my life. But yes, I think it can be. Empathy is actually very difficult to get right. I think it's incredibly important in a crisis situation. And very often people confuse empathy with just saying sorry or having sympathy for what somebody's going through. Of course, it's not the same. Empathy is broadly the ability to understand what somebody else is feeling from their point of view and not from your point of view. And actually, if you're a leader and your job, in part at least, is to defend the reputation of your company, that can be quite hard to do. It can be quite hard to shift from what should my company say in this crisis situation to what do people actually need to hear from me. So that's tough for a leader, I think, to do very often, because their primary concern is the reputation, the value, the valuation, the share price, whatever, of the company. So they're inclined to come at the crisis from their own point of view.
Right. I mean, why is empathy so, why do you consider empathy so important? We get so many firms apologizing for this, apologizing for that. Well, what you want to actually see is people doing something to overcome a problem.
And actually, I think empathy leads to action, or it should do, real empathy, because if you're really understanding the crisis from somebody else's point of view, you'll understand that what they want is not a sort of legalese half apology, but what they want really is to see action. And there are some really good examples of this. And the most obvious one, I think, is the United Airlines example in 2017, when a Dr. David Dow, I'm sure everybody on this call will know this example, but I'll just very quickly talk through what happened. There was a Dr. David Dow, who was a 69-year-old doctor, was flying on a United flight from Chicago to Louisville, and the airline, as very often happens, needed some volunteers to give up their seats because some airline staff needed those seats. And when nobody volunteered, even I think they were offering about $400 for people to change, but actually nobody volunteered. So the airline said, we're going to forcibly remove somebody from the flight, which they did. And they really did remove him forcibly. Dr. David Dow refused to leave initially, and he was dragged off that flight. His head hit the armrest. He ended up with a broken nose, 2 broken teeth, I think, and concussion. And of course, that was filmed and put on the internet as it was happening live. And the very first statement from the CEO of United Airlines sort of gave an apology, but it said, this is an upsetting event to all of us here at United, not poor old Dr. David Dow, who's being dragged off the plane. And then the really brilliant line was, he said, I apologize for having to reaccommodate these passengers. And of course that led to, all sorts of outrage and hilarity. Yeah. I mean, it was really interesting, because that whole thing actually cost United, I think it was about $700 million in share damage. I mean, that recovered pretty quickly, so it wasn't lasting damage to the firm, but still, it's not something you want to go through. And he did listen to opinion on it. To be fair to him, he did listen to opinion. His next statement was much, much better, and actually talked about how other people had seen that incident and what the impact might have been on Dow himself. Indeed. So I think that's a good example of where empathy was not in action, and perhaps should have been.
I mean, I sometimes put it, don't do or say anything out of touch with the public mood. And if you do that, you're going to get, you're either going to make a crisis worse or actually create a crisis, which of course
absolutely
is exactly what the airline did. Okay, brilliant. Well, I'm going to keep the pace up here and move on. And this is my particular favorite in your book. It's in one of the earlier chapters, but you talk about a kind of psychological contract between consumers and the brands they love. And the way you talk about it is almost like a sort of love affair. and well, it's true, isn't it? And the way you talk about it, and when the love affair is over, the sort of love turns to hate.
Yeah.
So, what are the in fact, I've got another slide here, which I'm going to put up because this is from the book. But my question is, what can cause this break? And indeed, how can the break be fixed? And those are some points there that I've just thrown up onto the PowerPoint slide. And I don't know if you want to talk through it in those form, but those are the kind of things that trigger a negative response, in your opinion.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting idea, this psychological contract, isn't it? And it came from Jill Green, who's a clinical psychologist, who's an absolutely amazing woman and works with all sorts of corporates. But she says that we believe that we have a deal with brands, whether that's inferred rather than actually explicitly stated. So we think that the brand stands for something. And Facebook might be an example, for example. So its T's and C's, fairly clearly say that they can do whatever they like with our data. But actually, when the Cambridge Analytica scandal happened, people felt that their trust had been broken with Facebook, even though actually, technically our data is owned by Facebook as soon as we put it into Facebook. But it's a trust issue, I think, and particularly in the case of Facebook, this is a place where we share personal stories, big events in our lives, pictures of our kids. So we have to have that kind of trust. And as soon as that trust is broken, that did feel like a contract had been broken.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that's interesting about this contract is that these days a brand, and not just, I don't just mean a clothing brand that we wear, so it's very obviously part of our identity, but the brands that we buy and the things that we do are part of our social identity, our social currency. So the car we drive, for example, says something about how we feel about the environment, or whether we choose to fly, or the organizations that we support. And of course we do all these things very publicly now, so they're part of our social identity, and I think that's where the contract is so important.
Kate, presumably these are just a few. I mean, most of us don't think about brands that much, or maybe it's just me, I don't know. I mean, I suppose there are a few that I really identify with, and I guess that's what you're talking about, really.
Yeah, it is. And I teach at a US university occasionally, and always ask the youngsters there about the brands that they really identify with, and particularly the ones they boycott, because I think that's that's the ultimate sort of negative response to a brand, is to boycott it. And these are really the 5 things that come up again and again for them. And they are, I mean, we're probably, I'm not being rude, but we're probably slightly older perhaps than,
well, you can speak for yourself, Kate.
than these youngsters. And actually they do care passionately about how brands behave, not just the products that they buy from them.
Yeah.
And
So
if a brand...
they seem to be doing something unethical.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, for example, there was a girl in one of the classes that I was teaching who said that she always boycotts Chick-fil-A because of its stance on gay marriage, and her mother is gay, so that hurts her. So that's a typical example of hurting something she relates to. Facebook might be an example of a brand that took away our control. It took away control of our data. But there are a couple of interesting things that I think. So if something goes against its own ethics, so Boohoo, for example, is the UK retailer, and it was found to be selling real fur instead of fake fur, and it's endorsed by PETA, the animal rights campaign group. And so that hurt its reputation pretty badly. That's a pretty bad thing. It really went against its own ethics. But when you look at somebody like Amazon, which is fairly resilient to boycotts, people boycott it for allegedly evading tax, or perhaps worker conditions, but because it's never held itself up to be this ultra ethical company, it kind of gets away with it. It's really interesting.
Well, and Boohoo didn't, because they
didn't.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I always say, sorry, I'm going slightly off piste here, but when I talk to companies, I do think companies need credibility in the bank if they're hit with a crisis, if you see.
Oh, they absolutely do. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, gosh, I hope I'm not going to get in trouble saying this, but I have a suspicion we might talk about TalkTalk and their data breach a bit later. And, I mean, fine company and all, but they didn't have huge amounts of public trust in the bank. And I think that probably hit them a little bit more. But I don't know, maybe you disagree with that, Kate.
I always say that the reputation you have going into the crisis is the one that will see you through the crisis. And you have to do a lot of the work up front in order to manage the company's reputation if you're going to get through the crisis. You can't suddenly raise trust at the point at which a crisis hits.
Just looking at your the 5 things there, when you say it takes away our control, what does that mean?
Well, I think if we have trusted the brand with information, it's particularly relevant in data breach, actually.
Oh, I see.
If we've trusted the brand with something, and then something happens to it that we have no control over, that makes us really angry, and that might trigger negative behavior.
Okay. All right. Great. Are we good on this, or is there anything else you wanted to add on?
No, I think we're good on that.
Okay. Excellent stuff. Well, I'm going to hit our listeners now with a. We haven't had any questions yet. I think we need some questions from our listeners as well. So do pop some in if you've got a question for Kate. But I've got another poll now, and let me see. Where is this one? Here we go. I'm launching a poll now, and I'd like you to vote on it. Would you consider using social media in a crisis? Well, obviously some people would, and I'm probably think that Kate might, but there's a dark side to social media. It can really come back to bite you. Is it something you would fear doing in a crisis, using social media? We've got 72% of people voted. Anybody else going to vote? Anybody else going to vote? Okay, let's keep this moving along quickly. So I'm going to end the poll now. and I'm going to launch the results. It's quite interesting, actually, Kate. Can you see this? So
Yeah.
would you consider using social media in a crisis? And yes, 68% said they would, and maybe was 32%. So
But nobody's saying no. That's great,
yeah, it's
actually.
interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it is interesting.
Any thoughts on that? I mean, I guess you would. I mean, what is your thoughts on that?
I think that you can't put the genie back in the bottle with social
Yeah.
media, and whether you choose to engage on social media or not is not going to stop people having conversations. A very long time ago, when we first started doing these simulations, I worked with a law firm, and we heard one of the lawyers advising their client to shut down Twitter in a crisis. And of course, you can't. You can't. It doesn't stop people talking about you. It's like putting your fingers in your ears. So I think there are ways of using social media, different ways, which I'm sure we'll come on and talk about. But whether that's monitoring social media to hear what people are saying or proactively talking on social media, I think you have to engage.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Okay, I've got a question here from Rich. Um, what useful social media tools would you use for a PR crisis? I suppose we're probably talking about Hootsuite and stuff like that. Okay, what is your thought on that?
I think a good social listening tool is absolutely essential these days. And of course, how detailed it gets depends really on your budget, as ever. But the most important thing I think you can do is monitor what people are saying to you, because then you can start to understand what the public mood is and the public response. So I would say that's the most important thing.
Right. So, any particular tools that you would recommend, or you're not going to
I
advertise?
mean, to be honest, there are so many of them these
Yeah.
days. There are absolutely hundreds and hundreds of them. So whatever you feel most comfortable using, I think, whether it's a sort of free Hootsuite or a full-on Brandwatch um,
Yeah.
type tool, I think as long as you have a handle on what people are saying about your brand, it doesn't really necessarily matter which tool.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of people will use external PR companies to do this kind of work as well. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I lost you there for a second.
Oh, sorry. A lot of people will use external monitoring, media monitoring agencies to do this kind of work. Yeah. Hello, Kate. Right.
Sorry, Jim. The sound dipped, and it looks as though it might have dipped for a couple of other people as
Yeah,
well.
I think so. Can you
But
hear me?
you're back now, though, so that's good.
Okay. I don't know if it's my rubbish internet. I do apologize if it's. Yes, I'm getting a lot of people. I cannot hear Jim, says Abby, much to her relief. I've got actually, if you can, do keep me posted here if you can't hear me. But a question from Gary. Okay, it's a good question here. When using social media in a crisis, do you respond to individuals or keep it high level and generic?
It's a really interesting question. This is one we get asked all the time, actually. And of course, I'm going to give you a very good PR answer, which is it depends. So I think when you're dealing with high volumes, it's going to be very difficult to deal with absolutely everybody in a crisis. If you're dealing with, if you're a big B2C company and you're dealing with thousands and thousands of requests, you're probably not going to be able to respond to everybody. So what we advise is to triage the questions and comments you get. The first is to really prioritize the people who are most directly affected by the crisis.
Yeah.
So the people who have the biggest impact, and respond and deal with them first. Then deal with the people who've been indirectly affected. So that might be that their family or friends have been impacted, for example, or they're an interested party for whatever reason. And then thirdly and finally, everybody else, if you have time. There will be lots of people who are just commenting and want their own voice to be heard against the crisis, and you may not have time to deal with them, and that's fine. And you can group responses to those people, but focus first of all on the people who are most directly affected.
Okay, all right. We're getting quite a lot of questions here, which are quite interesting, Kate. So I think I'm just going to hit you with these. Jim asked the question. I think this is, I'm sure you've dealt with this. Do you encourage a social media policy within organizations, particularly to support employee behaviors and corporate culture? What's your thoughts on that? Allowing people to tweet, are they allowed to use branding and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. It's again fascinating. I think thinking has really changed on this in recent years. I think in even 5 years ago, people would be very much shut down everybody talking on social media, tell them they're not allowed to.
Yeah.
But actually, you can't do that. I think you have to assume that everything you say internally is going to get leaked these days. Now, I wouldn't necessarily encourage your employees to comment on the crisis in social media, of course. They can often do more damage than anything else. But if you're keeping them informed as a really important audience in the same way that you would keep media informed or your customers, then hopefully what they say about you won't actually damage you. So I think that's the best thing you can do. And at that point, a policy is of course important. They have a duty to protect the reputation of the company, but I don't think it's realistic anymore to expect people not to talk at all about it.
Yeah, okay. All right, good. Abby's asking a question. I don't know the answer to this. I don't know if you do, Kate, is asking about how TravelX UK are dealing with their data breach. Do you know about that at all?
A little bit, yeah. Funny enough, I was reading a bit about it yesterday, and I was fascinated that even some of the really reputable media outlets were saying that TravelX had refused to say, and that's a direct quote from the BBC, at what point normal operations would be restored. And that is never a good look, is it? I mean, you really want them to be open and honest and say exactly what they know, what they don't know. And then, people aren't always going to have all the answers in a crisis. They might say, we're not sure why this has happened and we're finding out and we hope to have an answer for you, tomorrow or 2 weeks' time, whatever it is. But no, I don't think they've handled it brilliantly. And I think it does come to proactively keeping people informed.
Okay, all right, good. We've got a couple other questions here, but I think we need to move on with where we're going. We'll come back to questions from panelists in a moment. And just ask you, what more to say about how would you analyze the effect of social media on crisis response? It's been a game changer, hasn't it?
It really has. And I always say that the principles of crisis communications haven't changed, but the environment in which we apply those principles has completely changed. And that's really what social media has done. And the biggest thing, as you said here, Jim, is the speed.
Yeah.
If you think that Facebook now gives you a fast responder badge on its own platform, if you're a brand, if you respond to 90% of posts within 15 minutes. Now that's setting an incredibly fast expectation for consumers about what they want from an organization. And in a crisis, you're probably not going to be able to respond in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And we want information, we all binge shows on Netflix and buy with Amazon Prime. We don't want to wait for anything. And we all kind of refresh our screens constantly on social media. So we're used to getting things very, very quickly. And if we don't, it makes us quite anxious. And we tend to think of social media as being the problem here, but actually that's a very human instinct. It's, from our cave-dwelling ancestors who wanted information quickly because they needed to make a quick decision. And it could have been life or death in those days.
I love the idea of our caveman ancestors using Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. They wouldn't have been getting their information from the same sources. But it's a very human instinct. So social media is actually just enabling that human instinct to come out.
The speed. The other side of it is, of course, the response. And Rich raises the question, would you use the same response across all media channels? I mean, I suppose we're back to the old classic of key messages and lines to take, but I guess you might tailor your response to individual audiences to some degree, right?
Yeah, I think you should mostly. I think you need to start with your core messaging, and it's quite common for companies just to put exactly the same message out to absolutely everybody on every channel. And your core messaging, of course, needs to say the same. But I do think there is an argument to socialize it, for want of a better word. It's a horrid word, actually, but to adapt it for social media a little bit. There may be different people wanting slightly different things on different platforms. You have to think about social media as being intrinsically personal spaces for people. So actually, very corporate statements may not work very well on Facebook. You probably wouldn't want to put a corporate statement ever on YouTube, for example, because you'll get a huge amount of abuse back. So I think you should tailor it for different channels.
And one thing I've always thought as well, Kate, is if you're a multinational company, words are freighted. Words have, a lot of depth to them. And a word that might be appropriate to use in London might not be appropriate to use in Sydney, say.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm always very keen that if you're a multinational company, that you would either a statement, a press statement, or whatever it might be, is actually written locally, or at least looked at locally to see that nothing jars.
Absolutely, especially if you're using humour. There are some instances where humour is appropriate in a crisis.
Yeah,
we always talk about the O2
Yeah.
network outage. But actually, if you're, as you say, if you're a multinational company, humor definitely doesn't travel in the same way. So you need to be very, very cautious.
Yeah, Mark's got a good point here. It's not really a question, it's a point, but I think it's quite a good one. That if suddenly an employee puts out something that's completely out of line with what the company is saying about a crisis, don't get in a spat with that employee online. Just take that offline and deal with the employee. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think generally try not to get into a spat with anyone online in a
Yeah,
crisis is good advice, actually.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
that's an interesting point, though, because sometimes if you can take the post down altogether so it's not seen, that's fine. But of course, with screenshots and so on, if you've got an employee who has said something that goes against what you want them to say, you might be better off addressing the issues publicly so that other people who see that comment can then see what the truth of the story is.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there is an argument to say you should respond, but I think it depends on the seriousness of the issue.
Indeed, yeah, indeed. Brendan, I think he was calling from Australia. Yes, he makes the point, and this is something I've talked about in the past as well, is that the way he phrases it. About reputation going into a crisis, we encourage our clients in a crisis to stand next to the problem and show leadership. The way I've put it in the past is to own a crisis and not run away from it. And the example I would use of that would be VW, Volkswagen, who, when they fitted their defeat devices in the car, they didn't own the problem and they tried to distance themselves from it. So I think, would you go along with this, Kate, or
Yeah, I mean, Brendan, I couldn't agree more. And I've got a story on this, which was we were working for a big financial services company, and we were running a simulation training course for about 100 people. And there was a big debate about how to respond, and the legal advice actually was don't respond at all. And so there was a group of people within the simulation saying, we've got our lawyers here, they're telling us not to do anything. Why is our crisis getting so much worse? And that led to a huge debate between the legal team and the comms team about how, whether to own the crisis, whether to apologize, whether to accept it. And of course, very differing opinions. And the upshot of that was that we were asked to put all their lawyers through a simulation so they could see what it was like to take their own advice. And as a result of that exercise, the lawyers have changed the advice they give into the business. And that was a really interesting exercise for me, because I thought, actually, if you bring those people into the process and get them to see what's going on social media, very often, these are smart people. They're going to see why legal advice on its own isn't necessarily the right answer. It has to be taken into consideration with reputation advice as well.
No, I mean, you must have been in the room with lawyers at some point, Kate, where they're telling you to say nothing, and it's quite
A
obvious.
lot, yeah. But I think it's changing, actually, to be fair. I do think that's
Okay.
changing. And I think the Thomas Cook example changed that. The two children who died was it Crete, I think, with a boiler that had a faulty boiler,
Yeah.
and they didn't accept liability for it because technically they weren't liable. And the legal advice was you're not liable, the hotel's liable. So don't accept liability. But actually, the cost of not accepting liability was greater than the cost of accepting liability, just in pure financial terms, which is really interesting.
Okay. Another couple of questions have come in, one from Electra and one from Rich, and they're both basically dealing with internal comms. Internal comms in sense of, would you use social media for internal comms? And Rich is saying, how would you manage your internal comms in a crisis? Mass email, group meeting, management only. Talk to us a little bit about your experience of talking with staff and employees during a crisis.
Yeah, and hi, Rich. I think we know each other from a previous life. So that's the internal comms is a really good point. And of course, and Jim, this is something that you'll know about, is that if we, if your system's gone down, like the NHS and the WannaCry example, for example, then actually communicating on email with your employees is not, you can't do it. You're not gonna be able to do it. You need another system, and that's, I guess, Jim, where something like Sentinel comes in.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I think you really need to work out the best channels to reach people on so that they will actually read it. If you're like me and you have fairly regularly kind of 1,500 unread emails in your inbox, then probably email isn't the best way to get hold of somebody. There might be other methods to do that. But I do think that you have to have an effective way of reaching all your employees, because they are a really critical audience for you. They're the people that are going to defend your brand, to their friends, their families, to each other. and they're going to be talking on social media probably about you as well.
Yeah, indeed. I'm very big on this as well, that some people get very energized by talking with the media and talking with external audiences. But in a crisis, the first audience you need to address is indeed your staff, because
Yeah.
they're going to get you through this crisis.
Yeah.
Now, we're on to another big topic here. Fake news. Now, just from your book again, I didn't realize, and maybe our audience don't know this, or maybe they do, is that actually fake news did come from a particular source, and that was BuzzFeed. Can you just
Yeah.
tell us about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term that we first think of as the term as we know it now, fake news, that we all know from Donald Trump, of course,
Yeah.
was actually coined in 2016 by BuzzFeed. And the editor then of BuzzFeed saw a number of interesting stories coming into his news feeds from various friends about the presidential election in 2016, and he saw that most of these were clearly misinformation or just totally made up. And he decided to investigate, and his investigations took him to Macedonia, to a small town called Veles in Macedonia. And he discovered that there was a man in Macedonia in Veles who wasn't desperately well off, was interested in making a bit of money, was quite good with computers, and thought, I must be able to put my skills to some use to make some money here. How do I do that? And he looked around and thought, actually, the way to make money is on Facebook or Google advertising. So how do I do that? I'm not going to be able to create stories necessarily in Macedonia that are going to make me very rich. So he looked to the biggest market in the world, the US, and he looked at the biggest story of the year, which of course was the US presidential election, the Trump versus Clinton election. And he created a news site that was satirical. If this is probably a nice way of putting it, fake news is another. And he started pumping out pro-Trump and pro-Clinton stories to measure and test. He did it very well, approached it in a very sensible way, measured and tested everything, and sensationalist headlines to see which ones would get the most clicks and therefore generate him the most income. And he discovered that the pro-Trump stories were generating more income. They were doing better. They were being shared more than the pro-Clinton stories. And you can make of that what you will, of course. But it was fascinating because a lot of his friends then thought, well, he's making some quite good money on this. They saw that it was the pro-Trump stories that were doing better. And when the editor of BuzzFeed visited Velez, I think there were 100 or so different sites set up in that small town simply to promote pro-Trump election stories in order to generate advertising through YouTube, Google, Facebook, and so on. And that is really what we're contending with. That's what we're up against as communicators, is people making money off misinformation. And that's quite frightening, actually. And although since then, a lot of the networks have done huge things to counteract fake news, it is still a really big problem for them.
Well, what can you do, Kate? I mean, it's just impossible. I mean, if
It's hard, isn't it? Yeah, and it's really hard as communicators because we're used to dealing, more or less in facts and the truth. And of course, we have a redress. If a journalist prints something that's clearly incorrect, we can get a statement corrected. We can get an apology into the publication, and in the most extreme situations, we'll take legal action. But of course, that's very difficult to do with social media. So I think what you have to do is you have to try and keep on top of it. There are a number of things. Trust is big thing here too.
Yeah.
We know that nobody trusts anybody anymore. So I think the most important thing in reputation terms for a brand or an organization is to build trust so that when you present the truth, people believe you. The issue at the moment, I think, is that if you dodge facts in a crisis, people don't believe what you're saying. They think you're obfuscating, they think you're hiding stuff. And so they're more likely to believe this misinformation. You have to set yourself up as the trusted voice of authority in a crisis. And that means staying on top of those rumors, refuting them publicly, and stating your facts as you know them quickly and effectively. And it's very, very difficult to do because you have to be totally transparent.
Absolutely. There was one thing that really interested me in your book. Well, in fact, there were several things. But one thing that I hadn't thought about before, because as you've just said, we've lost trust in a lot of things. We've lost trust in newspapers, in journalists, and now that sort of social media is thrown into the mix, as well as being just part of the media mix, we kind of lose trust in what we're being told. But a piece of research, and forgive me, I can't remember where it came from, but a piece of research in your book was that actually people don't trust brands or companies so much, but they still do trust individuals. I found
Yeah.
that very interesting.
That was from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a great
Okay.
resource, actually. Yeah, it is really interesting. And it's interesting when you think about your crisis response. So these, we tend to think of your initial statement being from the company, and then you wheel out the CEO at a point at which the crisis has, reached a certain stage. But actually, probably an individual responding to individuals is going to be better received. So it is slightly changing the way we think about our responses, I think, that with the fact we trust individuals. And we turn to our networks, don't we? We turn to our friends. If we don't trust an organization, you'll go to your friend for recommendations. You don't trust what a brand says. So you say, has anybody, I don't know, we do it every day of our lives. So does anybody recommend a good carpenter or a good plumber? And you trust what people say to you, but you don't necessarily trust what the firms are saying. And
Right.
that's the bit we have to break.
And so that's why, sort of zeroing in on this, that's why a chief executive or a spokesperson for a company is so unbelievably important. Is if we don't have trust in them, then they're really lost. But if they do seem like a trustworthy character, then I assume that can really help in terms of fake news and indeed in other aspects of a crisis as well.
Exactly. And also, I think what an individual says is going to be shared more on social media than a corporate statement. And
Right.
again, as communicators, we tend to focus on our response to the media, but actually hardly anybody pays for their news anymore. I think it's less than 10% of people pay for their news now. So actually we probably need to think in terms of humans talking to humans rather than just thinking about the media as a conduit.
Okay, well, let's move on to something else about influencers and third-party advocates. I'm quite often asked about this. If in a crisis, does it work to use? I'm not talking about social media influencers, selling products. I'm talking about in a crisis. Does it work to get somebody in to speak on behalf of your company or your brand? And quite often people will use like academics and people like that. But a lot of other people will say, well, look, you're just paying them. They'll just do what, they'll just say what, you want them to say, and it doesn't really get anywhere. Do you, in a crisis, would you advocate ever using a third-party advocate?
Well, I mean, my background is not in influencer marketing, but for the book, I talked to a guy called Scott Guthrie, who, I mean, he lives and breathes influencers. There's nothing very much he doesn't know about them. And he had a wonderful quote, which he said, make friends when you don't need them, not just when you do. And he applies that to influencers. So in a crisis, you need people who understand your brand. And influencers can be very useful in getting a message out quickly to people. But if you didn't already have a relationship with those influencers, that is not going to be appropriate. The influencers that you're already working with on a long-term basis probably will be very good spokespeople for your brand. In fact, they'll probably be spokespeople for your brand whether you want them to be or not. So you should definitely remember them. But I think getting somebody in as a kind of one-off paid mouthpiece is not effective. And I think that in some cases that could actually make the situation worse.
Yeah, because you've got to be careful of your influencers if they're caught doing something naughty as well, because that can.
Well, that's absolutely, absolutely. We see that quite a lot with sports
Yeah,
people, don't we?
indeed. All right, perhaps we'll leave that one away.
Yeah.
All right, I've got my third and final fascinating poll here for you. What am I asking you this time? Oh yes, data breach. We're going to get onto data breaches and cyber attacks and so forth. So I'm going to launch a poll here. It's a bit of a trick question in a way, so my question is: if a hack has taken place and customer data is lost, what do you do? Do you go public straight away, or do you sit on the information until you have all the facts? So if a hack or a data breach has taken place and you've lost customer data, what do you do? Do you go public straight away, or do you sit on information until you have all the facts? People are thinking about this one. We've only got 40% of people have voted. So just, if you wouldn't mind, I'd be really interested to see what you have to say. Half of everybody's vote. People are jumping in now. So last dibs on this. Last dibs on this. I'm going to end the poll now. Oh, people are still voting. Any more? 75%. I think we're going to go with 75%. And here, okay, are the results. So if you
that is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, because I mean, it was a bit of a trick question, because I was rather thinking about Talk here, where the Baroness Dido Harding, she got it from both angles. Poor lady. She was poorly briefed, was put out relatively early, but was still criticized for not speaking early enough, didn't have all the information, and couldn't say whether the information, the data that was stolen was encrypted or not. But
apart from that, it went
I
really
know you've
well.
got some thoughts on this as well. So, what was your thought on that issue there?
Talk was just, I mean, I felt so sorry for her in some
Yeah,
ways. We did some research, actually. I work with a company called The Social Element, who's my co-founder company for Polpeo, and they did some research into the TalkTalk cyber attack, along with a few other brands, actually, just to look at how social media mentions, negative social media mentions, tracked against the big events in the company, and looking at share price impact as well. And I think the social media mentions averaged 2,000 an hour, the negative posts that they were having to deal with at the height of that crisis, which is quite something, isn't it? But there was a huge amount of confusion, because I think the first statement said, or certainly one of the early statements said, that data had been breached as a result of a DDoS attack, which a few security experts were very quick to point out is actually technically impossible.
impossible.
So the DDoS attack could have taken out the website, but it wouldn't have actually breached the data. So that didn't help them, that early statement, because it didn't look as though they knew what they were doing in terms of security at all. And of course, then when, as you said, when Harding was interviewed, she couldn't give any details about the security systems that the company was using. There was also a meme that started, which was Harding sitting in front of a really old-looking VCR and a huge computer, one of those big old, I don't know what it was, but with sort of box computers, and people saying, no wonder their security, this is the technology they're using, no wonder their security's gone down. And of course, that was a picture that had been taken about 20 years ago of her in a completely different life. So that was, you have to deal with all those things as well. So it was very difficult. And there were all these rumors. I think there were various rumors that the ISIS was behind the attack, or the mafia, and then it was the Russian secret services, all these things. It turned out, of course, to be a teenager in his bedroom in Northern Ireland.
It was, it's an astonishing story. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, sorry, did you mention this already? Because she actually said there was loads more people affected than actually were.
She said 4 million originally, and it turned out to be 150,000. So I think they had what we call marketed their own crisis. Pretty effectively there. So they'd made it seem much worse than it was. And there are so many lessons, I think, from that. And to answer your question about the advice, which is you do have to get to the facts. Of course you do. But to get to the facts, you have to get the right people in the room to answer the right questions. And that takes really, really amazing leadership. And every board member now needs to understand security, especially the CEO. It's not okay anymore just to say, I don't really know about this, you need to talk to a specialist. People really need to understand security. This is our new normal now, data breach. Everybody's going to go through it at some point. We all have to understand it. And I think that's a real shift in thinking for many boards. But I also think, again, looking at the poll, do you go immediately, or do you wait until you've got all the facts? If you waited until you had all the facts in a crisis, you'd never say anything. On the other hand, you don't want to do a Dido Harding and go out and say, well, it could be 4 million people and it's all this information. You do need to communicate facts as you verify them. You don't have to have all of them, but you can drip feed the facts as you can verify them. But you've got to get to the truth quickly.
I remember she was interviewed on Newsnight by Kirsty Walk. Am I right? Yeah. And she was given both barrels by Kirsty for for speaking out soon enough. And I was thinking, for goodness sake, this poor woman. It was only the day after, but that was still. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah.
So on a cyber attack, what specific, I can't speak anymore, what specific advice would you have for communicators during a cyber attack?
I think it goes back to this telling the truth. I mean, obviously you have to follow legal advice and report to the ICO and all those things that you have to do. But I think generally, if you just apply all the usual principles of crisis communications, tell the truth, be open, verify the facts, tell people the verified facts as you have them, as you discover them. Make sure that you have absolutely the right people briefing you as a leader, so that you know the facts, that you got the facts to hand. You probably can't learn all about security at the point at which the data breach breaks, so you need to know that beforehand. We just have to assume that we're all going to to go through a data breach. So we need to be more clued up on security generally, I think, at board level. And then finally, say what you're doing to prevent this happening again. There's a lovely guy called John Brown from an agency called Don't Cry Wolf, who says you have to open all the doors in a crisis. You have to let people in, and I mean, not literally, but to almost walk around your office and see what you're doing to put it right. Show people what you're doing to make sure this never happens again.
Okay. I just from a slightly different perspective, with GDPR in place and so forth, I hope sort of people from overseas, this is a new general data protection. You have to, it's all to do with protecting personal data. But if you do have a data breach, you have to let the Information Commissioner's Office know in 72 hours. And I was sat in the room with some people from the Information Commissioner's Office the other day, and they are quite scary, by the way. And they made it quite clear that 72 hours was the outer limit, and that if you have a data breach, they would expect your call earlier. And to be fair to them, they were offering advice as well. It wasn't they were just going to, you know, give you hell. They had advice to. I don't. Have you worked with them at all? Have you been talked with the ICO at all, Kate?
No, I tend not to get involved actually in that way. So no, I'm probably not the right person to answer questions on the ICO response.
All right, very good, very good. Let's move on to, where are we? Oh gosh, time has run away with us. Just ask you this question. It's really for smaller companies, I suppose. You know, it can be exhausting dealing with a crisis. And when it comes to dealing with social media and so forth, you know, for a small company, I mean, let me give you an example. For example, when Tesco had the problem with horse meat scandal, remember, I'm sure everybody remembers the horse meat scandal. And they had a lot of criticism online, and Tesco, being a big, you know, clever brand, pretty much answered, I don't know if every tweet, but they certainly had a team of people answering questions, answering tweets online. But how can an SME, how can a small company possibly manage to do that? And what can they do if they're really on the receiving end of a battering in a social media crisis? Do you have any advice for smaller companies?
It's very difficult, and I work with a lot of smaller organisations or charitable organisations actually, helping them on exactly this point. I think it goes back to what I said earlier about triaging your responses. So really making sure you prioritise who you're talking to, but also setting expectations of time frames. If you're not going to respond in an hour, don't tell people you are going to. And just make sure you do use things like, you know, pinning posts to your social media channels so that you've got the latest information available and visible to everybody. Direct people perhaps to the best channel where you're updating your responses. Some people might be a dark site, or it might be a web page. It might be your Facebook page.
Can I just stop you there?
Sorry.
I think you need to explain perhaps to some people a dark website.
Sorry, a website that you have ready to show in the event of a crisis, that is quick to update, but that appears to be part of your ordinary website. So sometimes getting into your main website can be very clunky if you're a big corporate. So people have a site that is dark, that's not showing until a crisis hits, and then you've got a page ready to go that you can direct people to.
But I know this would different from organization to organization and from crisis to crisis, but would you typically leave your normal website up there? I suppose you might remove some advertising from your normal website.
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely removing the advertising. I mean, that's absolutely, and all your social media marketing posts as well, to pull them down. That's something that quite often we see gets forgotten.
Because of social, it's very hard for firms to kind of set the media agenda these days, but that's an important thing for them to do if they can, right?
If they can is the big thing, isn't it? And again, it comes down to being trusted and transparent. If the media trusts you, then they'll come to you for your view. If they don't, they won't. They'll go somewhere else. So it really depends on the reputation you have and the relationships you have with media, and whether they believe what you're going to say and they think you're going to add value. There's a really, when I do training with agencies, very often I set them an example. Actually, this goes back to the empathy thing as well, which is I get them to read out their statements to each other and role play being victims of the crisis, and then get them to read out their statements, see how it sounds. And one of the scenarios that I have set in the past is that you're smartphone manufacturer and you've had a fire at one of your factories and a few people have gone missing in the fire and may be dead. And what's your first response? And inevitably, everybody says we're aware of an issue involving one of our factories or an incident at one of our factories. They never ever say we know there's a fire. And I say to them, there are flames coming out of the roof. Everyone can see that there's a fire. Why won't you call it a fire? And people are very reluctant to use real language. They talk in jargon. So I think humanizing responses is part of building that trust.
Definitely. Just a question here about a dark website. Would that be a separate website domain altogether, or would it be a hidden page on the main website?
I think a hidden page on the main website, because you don't want to be seen to be deflecting people from your website. So a hidden page on your website is sensible.
Okay, excellent. Well, we're coming towards the end, folks. So if you have any questions, you better get in quick, because Kate is a busy lady and will be off. So get in any questions now. But my final question, Kate, to you is, you need to look into the crystal ball. Where are we going with this? Is everything going to be quicker, louder, faster, even more crazier? What trends do you see emerging?
Yes to all of those, basically. I think the lack of trust is the biggest thing that we're seeing, and I think that's going to continue. Sadly, I see no reason why that won't be the same in 2 or 5 years. I think the other thing that people are doing is we're seeing this on social media, that people are moving off big broadcast platforms and moving towards talking together in groups. And that makes it very, very difficult for a brand to see what's going on in the conversations, which makes things like social listening even more important, to hear the conversations where you can. If things are being taken off public networks and going into messenger apps, for example, that's tough as a brand. So you need to look at different kinds of monitoring tools and combining perhaps different kinds of monitoring tools.
If I can just jump in there, that's one thing we talk about at our firm a lot, that whilst WhatsApp is a fantastic resource and I use it, my family uses it all the time, using something like WhatsApp in a crisis can be very tricky, because you can't monitor what people have said. You don't know who was on the chat channels. People may have left the company and still be on a chat channel. So
absolutely,
if you want eyes on what is going on at the time, and if you want a post-incident report, if you use something like WhatsApp, as good as it is, it's not good for a crisis situation.
No, and you really can't. I mean, from an audit point of view as well, if you do get audited after the crisis, it's almost impossible to track where things have gone over WhatsApp. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
All right, great.
I also think that, as we said earlier, that having to think about how you'll communicate when all your systems are down. If we are going to be subject to things like the Travelex, where they were effectively held to ransom, you need to think about how you're going to communicate if none of your systems are working, and that's a very tough one for companies too. And this is going to become our new normal.
Okay. Do we want it to become our new normal?
No.
Matter. We're going to get it anyway.
Exactly.
All right, Kate. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. This seems like okay. I was hanging. Mark has just come in. Mark, yeah. Okay. WhatsApp uses the Facebook platform, so never share sensitive company info. That's Mark in Canada saying that. Yes.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah. Well, look, I think, Kate, unless you have anything to add, I think that's it. Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion, and I would certainly recommend that you seek out Kate's book as well, because it's a great read, and I may say, Kate, they're really well written in a very convivial kind of conversational way.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
It's an easy read, and so that's great. All right, folks, that's it for now. We'll be running another webinar next month with the antisocial engineer, he's called. Ooh, wonder what that's all about. He's a very interesting chap, Richard DeVere, and he's going to be joining me next time. But in the meantime, Kate, thanks so much for this fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And bye-bye, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye.